Hey, today we're going to dig into the Harlem Renaissance, and this is a really cool sort of time period because there's a lot of stuff going on. This is largely this largely comes out of something called the Great Migration from about 1910. Some people argue that it goes as late as the 1970s. Probably in the 60s and 70s. It's very, very much tapering off. But the biggest wave of this migration is 1910 until probably the 1940s is where I would peg the biggest surge of this migration. But what's happening during the Great Migration is that African Americans here in the South are being wildly mistreated. They're, being subjected to sharecropping and other instances, other things called convict leasing, which are absolutely horrible. There's lots and lots of lynchings and stuff going on down here. And so some African Americans, especially those that were able to do so, are going to migrate to the North. There's still issues in the North. There's still segregated housing, neighborhoods, and stuff like that. But the violent aspect of racism isn't as prevalent in the North by a long shot. There's still, race riots occasionally and stuff like that up north, but it's not anywhere near what it is down here in the South. And so a lot of African Americans after the Civil War, especially 1910 to probably I would say 1950 was the biggest kind of spot of this, are going to migrate to the North. And with that, lots of different stuff happens. But one of the really cool things that happens is something called the Harlem Renaissance. And this happens out of Harlem, New York, because it would be weird to name it the Harlem Renaissance if it was like in, Cincinnati or something. But the neighborhood of Harlem in that time period, 1910, 20s, 30s, had been a neighborhood of a lot of European people that had immigrated to America. But there are growing tensions, right before World War One, during World War One, after, and then the leading up to World War Two. There's a lot of tensions in Europe that halted the flow of new arrivals, and so the housing market in Harlem sort of slumps, and the retail market also slumps. And so there's a lot of retail buildings. There are a lot of housing up in Harlem, especially, that are fairly cheap. And so a lot of African Americans move to Harlem and settle in that area. Big thing, there are a lot of artists that flock to Harlem. And this becomes a really big focal point for the African American art scene for several decades. And we'll have a wide variety of musical venues, especially up in Harlem. We'll mention the very famous Cotton Club toward the end of the lecture, but it's a big music scene up in Harlem, but there's also painters and writers of novels, poets that are living up there, people that are writing plays, and all sorts of sculptors. Harlem is the art sort of, highlight for the African American community during this period. Another thing that happens during this time period, and we'll talk about this here in a minute because it is important on what's going on for a number of ways, is that the Harlem Renaissance also harnesses this white infatuation with African American art. So you have a lot of the white community that is going to consume some of the music, some of the paintings, the plays, and the literature that are all coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. And a lot of them will become patrons of that. So it'll feed money into the African American community. And it'll also, give some recognition to African American abilities, because there's not a lot of that before, especially from the white community. There's a whole lot of just downgrading the African American ability to do anything, and so Harlem Renaissance really kind of pushes that out there a little bit. So one of the big people in the Harlem Renaissance is a guy named Alan Locke. And Locke is a professor at Howard University, and he starts collecting African American writing in the 1920s and 30s. And usually they're short stories and other kind of things like that, some poems. And he publishes these in a magazine called the Survey Graphic. Later on, some of these will become published in books, but we're seeing some stuff happen. Locke is really putting this stuff out there, and he's giving it legitimacy because you've got a university professor that is promoting, he's an African-American guy at an African-American university, but he's also promoting African-American art and literature. And one of the big things that allows for him to do so is the increasing economy of publication. It becomes a bit cheaper to publish poetry and novels. It's not quite as expensive as it used to be. And so, African-American writers have more access, and Locke is really pushing that to get that out there. Another thing in the same vein is that, access to electronic goods and services becomes more widely available. Technology becomes cheaper, and it always, not always, but usually technology becomes a lot cheaper. And so phonographs are becoming more and more widely available. Radio becomes more and more widely available. On one of the next slides, we even have a Black-owned record company. And so, these forms of artistry become more and more widely available to the American public. And a big thing, especially on music, and we're going to talk about music more than anything else in this lecture, especially on music, if you're just listening to the radio, it's not easily apparent what race the artist is. Even the singers, it's not easily apparent what race this person is that's singing. And so you might have people that are white folks that are jamming to African American artists, and they don't even quite realize that they're doing that until much later. You might listen to some Louis Armstrong or some Duke Ellington and never really think about what race these guys are, and it never may even occur to you that they're a different race from your own. And you get into the music and I like this is kind of cool. And then later you find out maybe that this is an African American artist. And as a white person, it kind of gets in your head a little bit like, hey, maybe these people are very capable. Maybe they're just as capable as anybody else. And I know that sounds weird, but if you put yourself in 1910 and 1920s, that's a little bit more of a foreign concept, than we would kind of readily figure into today. Also radio allows people, and phonographs as well, allows people that are all over the country that are not necessarily going to be able to make it to Chicago or make it to Harlem or any of these big venues to go and see people like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and stuff like that. So, sorry, we're working on changing slides. I'm more into music than painting and other stuff like that. that's super, super great, but I'm more into music than most other. Comic books are awesome. um, but some stuff also happens on the music scene. Some really big stuff happens on the music scene. In 1920, an artist named Mamie Smith. Smith was a singer on vaudeville. She recorded Crazy Blues for Oka Records. Big thing, scribble down, underline, remember this. This is the first African American woman to record a blues record for a major company. So by doing that and by getting her name out there, and record companies are seeing that African American women artists, women blues artists are going to sell, Smith is going to open the doors for other African American women artists as well. So next up, we've got Bessie Smith. She's going to make several recordings. Ma Rainey, we'll talk about Ma Rainey here in a little while. We'll talk about Bessie Smith a little bit more. And other African American blues artists, women and men, are seen as money makers. This is important. And I know we don't like to think of, art should be art for art's sake, but you got to eat, right? And so these people are seen as money makers. And so the record companies are going to give them a chance. And they'll start pressing records and selling these records. And so you get African American blues artists, men and women, are going to be making more of a living than they had previously, and that will open the door for other people. Bessie Smith, about a year after Mamie Smith, not related as far as I know, Bessie Smith recorded Downhearted Blues, and it sold 750,000 copies in the year that she recorded it. So people are lining up to buy her records. Bessie Smith is awesome. I listen to Bessie Smith somewhat regularly. And so that helps. After these women artists are getting a following from the record company is going to start looking into men bluesmen. And so we'll see some of these guys. Some of the early ones, Blind Lemon Jefferson. I don't have to remember him. He's still pretty cool. Later on that first year, some of the record companies will start going into the Mississippi Delta region. The Mississippi River goes down into Mississippi, and it kind of splinters out. And that's the Delta region. Record companies start recording Mississippi Delta blues. It's a different sort of genre of blues than other sort of mainstream forms of blues. A big person that you've probably heard, maybe, and you've definitely, hopefully, probably heard one of the songs that he sings is Leadbelly. Leadbelly, a couple of his more famous songs are Good Night, Irene. You may or not have heard that one. Definitely, you've probably heard Where Did You Sleep Last Night? The first time I heard Where Did You Sleep Last Night, I heard it as a Nirvana cover in the 1990s. It's on their Unplugged album if you want to check that out. But also listen to Leadbelly's version. It's very, very cool. But, we have a genre of music, the blues, that appeals to a very, very wide audience. And so white people are listening to this music, African American people are listening to this music, and it opens doors. You've got white people that maybe wouldn't necessarily go into the African American community or anything like that, but they like this music, and they're willing to go to some of these African American shows. They're willing to buy some of these records that African American artists are putting out. One of the more famous bluesmen later on that gets a lot of attention at the time and even today is Robert Johnson. You may or may not have heard of him, but you've probably heard of the story of Robert Johnson. He's a very short-lived blues artist. I think that he was caught having an affair with some other guy's wife and was killed as a result of that. But the big thing, the kind of mythology that surrounds Robert Johnson is supposedly Robert Johnson met the devil at a crossroads down in Mississippi and sold his soul for the ability to be a great guitarist. And that gets covered a lot in other media. If you've ever seen Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, there's an artist in there. I don't remember if the guitar player like literally says his name is Robert Johnson. I think he does, but they kind of make a gag about it, that he sold his soul to the devil. I've watched a documentary with Ozzy Osbourne, and him and his son Jack went down to Mississippi to this particular crossroads to see the spot that Robert Johnson supposedly sold his soul. But this appeals to a whole lot of different people. And a lot of different people are going to consume this music, and this opens up things. Another thing that is really interesting, a lot of these artists are going to flaunt their sexuality, and sexuality sells records. Most of you guys are probably in your early 20s or something, so you weren't alive when this happened, but in the late 1980s, there were congressional hearings about the supposed influence of bad music. And there were a group of people called the Washington Wives that, had congressional hearings, and they called in, subpoenaed different artists and stuff like that. And the music industry started putting those parental guidance explicit lyrics stickers on records. And when I was growing up, those were new, and I literally bought a couple of records because it had that sticker on it. I didn't know who the artist was. I was just like, hey, this has some profanity on it. I'm going to buy this. So sexuality, bad language and stuff like that sells records sometimes. And so this does too, and so Bessie Smith, if you want to listen to any of these songs, they're great. Bessie Smith is somewhat graphic in her lyrics. And so if you do listen to some of this, she is definitely talking about some sexuality issues. And so if that's not your thing, that's okay. But if you're okay with hearing that, kind of look up some of these songs on YouTube. But Bessie Smith's got Hot Dog Man, Kitchen Man, Sugar in My Bowl. All of those are very, very clearly, they're pretty obvious metaphors. Like she's not really hiding anything, but she is kind of throwing that stuff out there. Another great song by Robert Johnson is Terraplane Blues. Johnson is talking about someone else has been driving his car while he has been out of town. And he's talking about, there's different things in his car that are set up differently. Somebody else has been in his car. And it, on the surface, very much sounds like, well, somebody's been, driving his car around town while he's been gone. He's not talking about someone's been driving his car. He's talking about somebody has been having relations with his girlfriend, wife. I don't know who he's talking about, but his significant other, somebody has been having relations with her while he has been out of town. Another person that is very, very sort of forward for the time, Ma Rainey. Ma Rainey has at least 5 songs in her catalog that suggest that she is interested in having relationships with other women. Ma Rainey and a couple of other blues artists women artists do dress as men. They kind of, sort of have this sort of gender fluidity in the 1920s and 30s. One of Ma Rainey's songs, Prove It To Me Blues, has a pretty big line. And yeah, you could interpret that as, well, she's just hanging out with it's a girls' night out kind of a thing. But, judging by some of the other lyrics and some of the other songs and some of Ma Rainey's comments and, stuff like that, she's into women, which is cool. But, went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women because I don't like men. Very cool. And, it's kind of forward thinking that she's talking about lesbianism in the 1920s and 30s and stuff like that. So now, anytime you have something like that, anytime you are flaunting sexuality in music or visual arts or anything like that, you're going to get some pushback. That's just, we kind of have some people that are not comfortable with that, and they are publicly going to push back against that. And we have that here, and it's kind of interesting. We have that here, and it's cool because it shows that the African American community is not of one mind. You can't ever think of one community having one mind on any issue. As we're moving through this period, as far as African American community uplift, W.E.B. Du Bois has a whole lot of different ideas than other African American leaders. They definitely have, different takes on that. W.E.B. Du Bois is one African American leader, and he's trying to build up the middle class and show this respectability. And he's got this group, that he calls the Talented Tenth, and they have one agenda or one methodology, one methodology for African American uplift. But you also got Booker T. Washington, and he's got a completely different methodology for African American uplift. And so here you've got the same thing. You've got a group of African American artists that are like, hey, it's completely fine to flaunt sexuality. It's completely fine. It's part of the human experience. And then you've got other African American artists and a record company. You've got the first African American record company with Black Swan Records. And the owner of Black Swan is a guy named Harry Pace. And he is really not interested in, Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey and Robert Johnson, those artists like that are a little bit explicit and throwing out their sexuality and stuff like that. That's not that refined image that the NAACP is trying to promote. The NAACP and its leadership, W.E.B. Du Bois, are really pushing for middle class respectability and promoting education and promoting refinement. And so Black Swan very publicly does not go for any of that kind of flaunting of sexuality stuff. It's an African American owned record company. They only have African American artists, but they're going to record things like spirituals, operas, classical stuff. They do have some blues and they do have some ragtime, but those are going to be very kind of PG rated sort of music there, and they're not going to go for anything else. And a big thing, much like the NAACP, Pace saw Black Swan as a vehicle for African American advancement. We're putting out this refined, fancy, culturally uplifting music, and that's what they're trying to sort of throw out the image of African Americans as, hey, we're also refined, we're also into classical music, sort of an educated lot, kind of stuff like that. They very publicly make a big deal about refusing to sign a contract with Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith is like, most of her songs have a sexual bent to them. And so she records for Columbia Records, a white-owned record shop, record company, sorry. Um, so, but those sell, and unfortunately Black Swan is going to fold after, I don't know how long they're in operation, but after a certain number of years, Black Swan folds because the more popular music is that kind of risque music. That's what sells. And so Smith goes and records with Columbia, Ma Rainey with her, music, risque music that sometimes hints at relationships with other women. She's going to go to record with Paramount. Paramount's still around. Columbia's still around. Jelly Roll Morton, bluesman. Sometimes he gets a little bit risque and some other, stuff like that. He's going to record with Gennett Records. Gennett's no longer around. I don't know if they got absorbed by somebody else or not. Don't remember. So we have, a lot of different genres of music that are coming out of the Harlem Renaissance, and African-American artists are going to play at different venues. Something that we sort of addressed a little bit earlier at the beginning of this, that music is going to appeal to a wide base of people. And so there are a lot of white folks that get really into a lot of African-American music. And sometimes these white folks will go into the African-American community to hear these African-American artists. And they'll go to clubs in the African-American community to hear these African-American artists. One of the most famous clubs to go and hear people like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington. Sometimes you could probably go and see Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith there, is the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club is located in downtown Harlem. It used to be owned by Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world. He owned the Cotton Club earlier. I don't think it was called the Cotton Club. It probably had a different name at the time, but it was basically a restaurant. It was a supper club. When he ran it, he eventually sold it. In this incarnation, it's owned by a mobster. But the really weird thing, and do get this down because it's a very strange concept. You've got those white people coming into the community, consuming African American music, but the Cotton Club only allows for white people to be customers and patrons. African Americans in this club that is downtown Harlem in the middle of the African American community only seeks out dollars from white customers. And this is the nicest club in Harlem. But yet, again, you've got white people that are wanting to experience African American culture and listen to African American, music, but they're doing so in this safe little bubble. They can go into the Cotton Club and they're not going to sit next to African Americans at other tables or even at their own table. There's only white people out in the audience, and they're there to see African American acts, music, and stuff. But they're just there taking part in something that other historians have called the white gaze, G-A-Z-E. That they're kind of sheltered in this little bubble, and they're able to listen to this music and really enjoy the music and stuff. But they're not rubbing shoulders with African Americans, and it's this kind of very timidly sort of reaching into the African American community and taking part in this. Like I said, the Cotton Club is the most famous club. It gets the most attention. It's the nicest club. There are other clubs in Harlem that are integrated clubs. That if you know, if you're okay and you are not, just kind of, I can't be around other people from other races. There's other clubs in downtown Harlem called Black and Tan clubs. And these are integrated clubs. They're not as famous or exclusive as the Cotton Club or any of those other sort of segregated clubs. But there are clubs down there that, white people go, and there are African American patrons there and stuff like that. Um, overall, though, the Harlem Renaissance has sort of a mixed legacy, to me anyway. On the one side, and I'm putting that in quotes, this is just me putting proper art in quotes. What I mean by proper art, and I don't really like that term, probably high art. If you're into a lot of art stuff, you would probably refer to this as high art. Um, sort of sculpture, painting, classical music, spirituals, stuff like that. Um, the the sort of proper art that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance is great for community uplift. It reflects the middle class values, and sort of presents the African American community to the United States, as the larger population of the United States, as artistic, refined, and intellectual. And all of those things are what, big parts of the African American community, but they're really working really hard to show the rest of the United States that this is a part of the African American experience. They are artistic and intellectuals and refined and stuff like that. And that's the big message, likewise, that the NAACP is putting out. They're trying to show this very proper, upstanding, upwardly mobile segment of society that the African American community is capable of. At the same time, and maybe this is referred to as low art, not really, onto the art scene as much. It's very cool, but I don't know terminology there. But low art, I kind of like that raw humanity descriptor for it. At the same time, the Harlem Renaissance, through Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. Claude McKay is a poet. Claude McKay wrote a poem called If We Must Die. And it is very, very raw. And it is, it's an angry poem. And it talks about challenging, racism and oppression and lynching and stuff. And that, if we must die, we need to die fighting back, kind of a thing. Go and read Claude McKay's If We Must Die. But you also have, in the blues world that we mentioned, all of that raw sexuality and fun sexuality stuff. You've got, LGBTQ issues in there. You've got straight sexuality with Bessie Smith, but you've also got heartbreak and frustration and jealousy and all those other emotions that are part of the human experience. And so, that kind of attracts to everybody's emotions because everybody feels those things. And so I think the Harlem Renaissance was trying to do a couple of different things. It was trying to appeal to the sort of fancy, art community, but then the sort of the, lack of a better word, common art community, low art and stuff. And I think it shows the broad expression and capabilities of the African American community that a lot of people had doubts about right now. In the 1910s and 1920s, a lot of people were still very, very much in doubt of the capabilities of African Americans. It's a really sad thing, but that was the time period that was in a lot of the white community's heads anyway. And I think the Harvard Renaissance really challenges that. and really attempts to put a check on that sort of mindset. So art's cool. Art is doing things. Art is making some cultural changes. So we'll talk at you next time.